Once upon a tall tale. The White Hat with the Gold Butterfly by Morgan Olson. Once Upon a Tall Tale Season 0 Episode 6. There was a stretch of years out west when folks got more afraid of signs than of sins. A sin required doing. A man had to steal, lie, or draw iron first. A sign was easier. A sign could sit quietly on a porch rail or hang from a man's shoulders without him knowing it. Signs didn't wait for proof. They just waited for people to start believing. That was about the time Sen began riding through the country. He never arrived in a hurry. Men in a hurry stirred dust and trouble both. Sen rode steady on a pale horse with a dark mane and patient eyes, carrying a leather satchel full of slim pamphlets tied with string. The horse moved like something that had learned, over a long time, that the road always continued. He wore a white hat so clean it looked less like clothing than an opinion. The hat was the first thing people noticed. The second was his stillness. Most men fidgeted. With a brim, with a coin, with the collar of a coat that never quite fit right. Sen did not fidget. He gave the impression of a man who had already decided everything worth deciding and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. By afternoon in any town he visited, little stacks of pamphlets would appear. On the counter at the general store, beside hymnals in the church vestibule, tucked into the corner shelf at the schoolhouse. Nobody saw him place them. They were simply there, the way shadows are at noon, or the smell of rain before it arrives. They all bore the same title, Dangerous Times, How Good Towns Stay Good. Jed Mercer was the first to notice them in his store. He picked one up with 2 fingers like it might be contagious. Amos Pike leaned over the counter to look. Dangerous Times, Jed said. You seen this before? Amos squinted. Looks like church reading. Jed snorted. Ain't church reading if it's stacked next to tobacco. He flipped through the pages slowly. The paper was cheap, but the printing was neat. Small stories filled the booklet. Little cautionary tales about towns that hesitated when they should have acted. Towns that trusted too easily. A widow who let a stranger sleep in the barn 3 nights running and found her silver missing on the 4th morning. Amos tapped the page. What's it say? Jed shrugged. Mostly says a good town stays alert. Alert to what? Jed frowned. That part keeps changing. That was when the door creaked open and Sen stepped inside. He removed his gloves slowly, like a man who expected to stay a while. His smile was polite without being eager. He had the kind of face that was hard to argue with. Not because it threatened anything, but because it seemed to have already considered your objection and found it reasonable, but insufficient. Jed held up the pamphlet. You selling these? No, sir, Sen said. Giving them away? Sen leaned against the counter with the calm of a man who never feared being misunderstood. Folks tend to pay anyway. Amos scratched his chin. What are they supposed to fix? Nothing's broken yet. Amos chuckled. Then why warn people? Sen's eyes moved easily between the 2 men. Because warnings work better before anyone's angry. It was the kind of answer that made disagreement feel unnecessary. By the end of the week, most of the town had read the pamphlet. It never shouted its warnings. It spoke the way a careful neighbor might. Gently, with regret already built in, as though the telling of the thing was itself a small sadness the teller wished he could spare you. No names were ever used. No towns were marked on a map. Every story happened in a place described only as a town much like yours, which meant everyone imagined it was. But the most curious thing about the pamphlet wasn't the stories. It was the back page. There, beneath the final moral lesson, appeared a small advertisement framed in tidy ink. Send away your old hat. Receive a modern American cowboy hat in the newest respectable style. Below it sat a drawing of 3 hats in profile, wide-brimmed, clean, nearly identical. In small lettering beneath, "New beginnings start with what you wear," and an address, a post office box in a city 3 days east by rail. Young Eli Turner read that part 3 times before speaking. "Why would anyone do that?" he asked. Jed glanced up from his ledger. "Do what?" "Send away an old hat." Eli touched the brim on his own head. It was dark felt, with a stitched band his grandfather had carried across an ocean nobody in town could pronounce. "My granddad wore this one," Eli said. Jed shrugged. "New hats fit better." "My granddad's fit fine." Jed nodded toward the window. Outside, Sen stood near the hitching rail talking with 2 women as though he had known them since childhood. He was laughing softly at something one of them had said. The loose, easy laugh of a man with nothing to hide. "Then maybe your granddad had reasons," Jed said. Eli watched the stranger laugh again. "You think that fellow's got reasons too?" Jed closed his ledger. "Son," he said, "a man who rides that calm always has reasons." The change didn't arrive like a storm. Storms announced themselves. This was more like a shift in weather people didn't notice until they had already started dressing differently. Boys in the schoolyard began teasing each other. "Black hat!" one shouted. "White hat!" another answered. At first it was a joke, but jokes are where new rules enter. Through laughter, which is the least guarded door. Soon, men in the saloon started mentioning hats the way they used to mention the wind. As something that simply existed, that bore no arguing with. "He seems decent enough for a black hat sort. That fellow's got a white hat look about him." No one quite agreed what those words meant. Some said it was about the darkness of the felt. Some said it was about where a man came from. Some said it was about what a man's father had done, as though character were a thing that dried into the leather and could not be cleaned out. No one agreed, and it didn't matter. They had begun to feel the words, and feeling was enough to go on. Miss Larkin, the school teacher, was the first to speak to Sen plainly. She found him on the schoolhouse porch, placing another bundle of pamphlets on the bench. Eli Turner was sweeping the step nearby and stopped when he heard her voice. "You ever worry?" she said. "People will start judging each other too quickly?" Sen looked up with a polite smile. "They already do." "You're encouraging it." "No, ma'am." He straightened the stack so the edges lined up. "I'm giving them a language for what they already feel." "That sounds like power." "Only if people keep speaking it." Miss Larkin folded her arms. She had been teaching long enough to recognize the difference between a man being evasive and a man being careful. Sen was careful, every word placed just so, like stones across a creek, inviting you to cross without quite admitting he'd built the path. "And if they do?" she asked. Sen's eyes drifted toward the road where travelers passed beneath hats of every shape imaginable. "Then they'll know how to protect what's good." It was a handsome answer. That was part of the danger. Miss Larkin stood there another moment. Then she picked up one of the pamphlets, walked inside, and tacked it to the board at the front of her classroom with a single pin. Not as a lesson, but as a warning, the way you'd tack up a picture of a poisonous plant. By the next morning it had been taken down. Nobody said by whom. Eli had watched all of it from the step. He'd heard Miss Larkin name the thing exactly. He went home that evening and said nothing to anyone, which was its own kind of answer. The first real trouble arrived through a man named Mateo Ruiz. Mateo worked cattle north of town. He spoke little and kept his hat pulled low when the wind picked up. He had worked that land for 11 years, fixing fences others left broken, clearing drainage ditches that froze and thawed and froze again. His name came up in conversation only in a certain tone. Careful, abbreviated, the tone used for things people had decided not to examine too closely. His hat was black felt, old but carefully mended. There was fine stitching along the band. Red and gold thread, a pattern his mother had learned from her mother, who who had learned it in a country whose name the town couldn't place on any map they owned. One afternoon, Eli Turner sat down beside him outside the store. "Why don't you trade that hat in?" Eli asked. Mateo looked at him slowly. "My father wore this hat. They'll send you a new one." Mateo ran a thumb along the stitched band. "My father's hand stitched that." Eli shrugged. He was not a cruel boy. He was simply a boy who had read a pamphlet, heard a school teacher say the word power to a stranger's face, and gone home without saying a word. "People say the old ones carry the wrong kind of history." Mateo's voice stayed calm. History is history. But later that week, Mateo noticed fewer men inviting him to sit at their table. A chair that had always been available was suddenly claimed. A conversation that paused when he walked past did not resume until he had moved on. The following Sunday, he found someone had scrawled "black hat" on the stable door where he kept his horse. Nobody admitted writing it. Nobody said they approved of it either. They just said times were getting dangerous. What the town did not know was that many old hats carried more than sweat and weather. That Sunday night, after he had scrubbed the chalk from the stable door until the wood showed pale beneath it, Mateo sat alone with his father's hat in his lap. He had meant only to clean it. He worked his thumb along the band the way his father used to, following the red and gold thread without thinking, the way a man finds a familiar door in the dark. The room changed. Not a picture so much as a presence. Heat coming off a stone wall, wood smoke, the green smell of crushed herbs, and a woman's hands moving a needle through felt by lamplight. She was humming something with no words he had ever known, only the shape of them. His mother. The pattern under his thumb was the pattern she was sewing, and for as long as his thumb kept moving, she was there, alive, bent over the work in a village whose name he had never once heard spoken in this country. When he lifted his thumb, the village went out like a blown lamp. He sat in the dark a while. Then he set the hat on the peg by the door where his father had kept it, and his father's father before him. He was not the only one carrying such a thing, and he understood that now, without being told. Other men had folded their own freight into the felt. Prayers tucked into sweatbands, a brim bent to the line of a hill no one here would ever climb again. A wife's initials pressed above the sweat line by a man who had spent 3 years unable to speak. The letters left there like a ghost long after the hat was sold and resold twice over. A hat could outlast a language. It could keep a village breathing long after its owner had forgotten how to say its name. Mateo understood why a man might keep such a thing. What he did not yet understand was that the town had already decided keeping it was the crime. By autumn, boxes of old hats began leaving town wrapped in brown paper and twine. They traveled 3 days east by rail to a city where a warehouse stood unmarked on the edge of an industrial block. What happened inside that warehouse, nobody in town thought to ask. The hats arrived. The new ones came back. That was the whole of the transaction, as far as anyone was concerned. Men called it modernization. Women called it tidying up. The minister mentioned briefly that there was something wholesome about a fresh start. A young widow sent away the hat her husband had been wearing the day he died, and for a few weeks afterwards she felt lighter and less haunted and grateful for it. That was the cleverest part of the whole arrangement. It worked. It did exactly what it promised, on exactly the wound it promised to heal. The cost came later, and quietly, and never once arrived with a name attached. The new hats arrived in plain boxes, clean white felt, each nearly identical to the next. They kept the sun off. They had no stories in them. Mateo Ruiz was the last man in town who kept his. By spring, he found fewer cattle offered to his care. One evening, he walked into the saloon and discovered the room had grown quiet in the specific way rooms do when someone enters who is no longer expected. Someone muttered the word "black hat." It came from the back of the room, where the light was lowest. Mateo finished his drink without hurrying. He set the glass down gently, the way a man does when he knows he is being watched and refuses to give the watching anything to feed on. He left town the next morning. No one stopped him. They told themselves it was safer this way. Some believed it. Some just needed to say it until they did. Eli Turner watched Mateo ride out from the window of the general store. He stood there long enough that Jed asked him twice if he needed something. He was thinking about his grandfather's hat on the shelf above his bed. Dark felt, the band stitched in a country nobody here could name. He was thinking that it was the same kind of hat, that the same word had waited on the stable door for Mateo, and that a word like that, once it was loose, went looking for the next dark brim it could land on. He was 16. He wanted to sit at the tables that were filling up. He wanted to laugh the easy laugh and have it cost him nothing. He did not want to be a man who set his glass down with great care in a quiet room and then rode out alone in the morning while people told one another it was safer this way. He knew, standing there, exactly what he was holding. He had heard Miss Larkin name it to Sen's face. He understood it as well as anyone in town. That was the worst part. He understood it, and he did it anyway. The following week, he wrapped his grandfather's hat in brown paper and addressed it to the post office box 3 days east. He told himself it was just a hat. He told himself that for a long time afterward. That same winter, dreams began thinning. Not nightmares. Those remained. Those always do. Just absences. The widow who had sent her husband's hat away stopped dreaming of her mother's kitchen. The smell of a particular soap, the exact angle of afternoon light through a window that no longer stood. A farmer forgot the path to a river he had only ever seen in sleep. The losses were quiet enough that people mistook them for growing up. Years later, folks argued about whether Sen had ever really existed. Some said he was a salesman. Some said a preacher. Some said he was a government man doing the work that governments prefer not to sign their names to. Some said he was just a man who understood people better than they understood themselves, and that was its own kind of government. The pamphlets survived, yellowed and brittle, in a few attics and trunks. The hats remained, clean, identical, forgettable. The fear kept working, which is what fear does when no one tends it. It becomes the weather. Old Mrs. Weller finally ended the debate the way old women often do. Not with an argument, but with a fact. "You're all forgetting something," she said from her rocker. Jed Mercer looked over. "What's that?" "His hat." "White hat," Jed said. Mrs. Weller shook her head. "Not just white." The room grew quiet. "Little gold butterfly stitched on the side," she said. "Caught the light when he turned." "You sure?" Eli asked. Mrs. Weller nodded once. "Certain." She leaned back in the chair. "That's how I knew he wasn't from around here." No one spoke for a long time. Butterflies only show up when something has already been eaten.
Hello, I am the narrator of the Theater of Dreams. The timing of a man with a gold butterfly stitched is quite the omen. Dear listener, anything that takes away dreams but leaves nightmares is not and never will be a gift. Many places no longer exist in my part of the universe because of just this. This is why I am peddling my stories here to you, the fair listener. We will hear more from this vile character Sen and the man whom is probably his master. Don't lose faith, my friend. And don't forget, this Sunday we will finish The Disillusionment of Spicy Friends in Part 3 and find out exactly who put the destroyer on the path of destruction. Don't forget, we notice.
You don't always need treasure after the adventure. If you did the adventure correctly, well, I know a bunch of D&D players that would violently disagree. What I would love is if you subscribe to this channel to help others get their little mind treasures. Or maybe it is time for you to finally fold that hand. This episode is a work of fiction. Sundermill, Arizona territory does not appear on current maps, which is consistent with its general attitude toward being found. The Crescent Hotel does not exist. Halverson does not exist, though his practice of offering the plainest available Bible to anyone who asks for one without annotations is something we consider genuinely wise and are looking into personally. Elias Coombe was not a real person. He was, however, the kind of person who feels real, the kind who arranges things carefully from a great distance, who lets a man cheat him at cards on purpose, who writes a will that is actually a question, and who dies in a way that makes four strangers tell the truth in a desert. Static Oracle Press takes no position on whether people like this actually exist. We suspect they do. We suspect you have met one. J. Pettifer was not a lawyer. He read a book about it in 1872 and was never corrected. We find this reasonable. The $14,000 is fictional. The schoolhouse is fictional. Miss Hortensia Beale is fictional, and her 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days barricaded inside a one-room schoolhouse on principle is fictional. And her decision to unlock the door on the morning of the 16th of September is fictional. We choose to believe she went. Pearl learned to read. That part we are certain of. Copyright 2026. Morgan Olson / Static Oracle Press. All rights reserved.